from the Mutual Broadcasting System. This is STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk. Now, retired Marine Intelligence Officer and globally recognized risk expert Hal Kempfer.
Welcome to STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk, and our discussion today is going to be about kind of the backdrop, if you will, of what's going on. Not so much the particular tactical things or maybe the particular operational things, but a little bit to kind of give everybody a backdrop of Iran's deteriorating situation, particularly economically, but the economics drive the politics in light of the U.S. naval blockade and the potential resumption of U.S.-Israeli strikes, particularly as their comprehensive response or comprehensive proposal to the U.S. on ending this conflict or war basically was to go back to their original talking points. It wasn't really any proposal at all. It was just says, okay, the U.S. just goes back to everything that way it was before. And also, Iran will now control the Strait of Hormuz. And of course, that was completely unacceptable. And it kind of gives you a window of the thinking within the current regime and possibly who's in charge. Now, the Revolutionary Guard Corps, well, the government as a whole, the regime is facing something of an existential crisis with this entire, not just the conflict, but everything tied to the conflict. The Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, has consolidated power in the wake of this war and in the wake of the ceasefire in this war. And certainly that would seem rather logical. They are a genuine power center within Iranian politics and always have been for quite some time. They have not just political power, but they have military power. They are this kind of almost separate, they are a separate military force that in some ways overshadows the legitimate Iranian government military force. And so it's not surprising that they would try to consolidate power. But in doing so, they have made the crisis facing Iran's government far worse because it doesn't really give the government or the regime itself very much room to maneuver or negotiate simply because of what the IRGC is. Now, former Brigadier General Vahidi, and I've seen more recently they call him a Major General, and I'm assuming when he assumed full control of the Revolutionary Guard Corps, that's when they basically gave him a promotion of sorts, so I keep hearing him called Major General, so I will, of the IRGC, is definitely a hardcore extremist, all right? His life has been dedicated to what this Iranian regime and what the Revolutionary Guard Corps is all about, and that is spreading this Shiite theocratic revolution across the Middle East, certainly consolidating power across the Shia crescent and, that stretches from Iran all the way over into Lebanon. And, obviously building up a lot of support for the Houthis that have that strategic position along the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. And then also exacerbating the Sunni-Shia split or divide throughout not just the Middle East, but Sunni Shia divide in Islam worldwide. Now, the IRGC owns a thing called the Al-Quds Force. And I'm sure many have read about the Al-Quds Force. That is kind of it's sort of a covert arm that does all these things, kind of like Spectre, if you will, from the James Bond novels. But they are involved in, espionage, assassination, terrorism, insurgency, and also raising money for not just Iran, but also for the proxies. For example, Hezbollah has been assisted by them in a lot of their money-raising activities. Anyway, that's what the Al-Quds Force is. And they have basically been operating across multiple countries, engaged in all those nefarious activities and paramilitary mayhem. They are not above assassination at times, all right? They do not restrict their activities to the Middle East. They operate in Europe. They operate in the Western Hemisphere. In fact, in one famous operation some years back here in the U.S., they actually tried to hire a Mexican drug cartel to assassinate the Saudi Arabian ambassador in Washington, D.C. that tells you something about their thinking. That tells you a lot about what they are. That tells you about certainly how the Revolutionary Guard Corps views diplomatic norms. But that's what they did. And don't forget the horrific attacks, generally assigned to Hezbollah, but certainly backed by, trained by, and integrally involved with the planning of everything they do, with the Al-Quds Force and with the IRGC. And back in '83, those attacks included bombing the U.S. Embassy and, of course, the horrific bombing of the Marine barracks at Beirut International Airport. That was the first time I personally knew someone killed by a terrorist. We have to recognize that is what the thinking, the ideology, the purpose of the IRGC, at least the way they see themselves. Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf he's a politician. He's also a former IRGC brigadier general, which means here's somebody who has spent his life invested in the IRGC. This is somebody who sees his ideological focus is really shaped by what he's done in his life. And he's been the Speaker of the Parliament of Iran since 2020. But for those who think, well, he's a politician, he's not Revolutionary Guard Corps, I would turn around and say not much difference between his thinking and whatever you see coming out of the Revolutionary Guard Corps. Yeah, he's a politician. He's done a number of different things, but he was a brigadier general in the Revolutionary Guard Corps, and we have to always kind of keep that in mind. All right. And he's been handling pretty much a lot of the strategic matters involving Iran. In April, he led the negotiating team or the delegation that went over to Islamabad to meet with Vice President J.D. Vance when as Pakistanis have been kind of acting as our interlocutors with the Iranian. But when you look at his background, you look at what's going on there, you get a sense that, as a negotiating partner, it's fairly apparent that this is someone who is intrinsically enmeshed in what the IRGC is about. So as the IRGC is consolidating power, it's not, a lot of times it's kind of seen that he's a rival power to the IRGC. I don't know if that's really the way to put it, all right? I think he would probably see himself in a little bit different light. Now, IRGC's Commander-in-Chief, Major General Vahidi, he leads the country's tactical effort, I would say operational effort, and frankly, I think he really is the de facto strategic leader for the country. And then the president, Masoud Pezeshkian, manages kind of day-to-day state functions, but I think he's been almost sidelined in terms of what's going on. He seems to have been moved aside from any genuine command and control role, and I would recall when he was kind of publicly apologizing to the United Arab Emirates for all the strikes against him, as he was saying that publicly, which was quite the thing to hear. The IRGC was launching drones and missiles at the UAE, which tells you that whatever he's saying, he just doesn't seem to have a lot of control over what's happening there. And Vahidi is the one that's actually calling the shots. And Vahidi also controls access to the new supreme leader, Mujtaba Khomeini, who was, by all reports, seriously injured, disfigured, crippled in some ways, may have lost a leg or more than that in the attacks that killed his father and so many others, the opening strikes of the war. And no one is able to talk with him except for, and it's not clear if they're even talking with him, except for Vahidi and the inner circle of the IRGC. Wherever he is a closely held secret. And so there really isn't this government process where other like-minded or other minds can come in and help shape the views of the supreme leader. And in that regard, it really restricts the potential outcomes, decisions, policies coming out of the regime. And I think what we see from this process is the proposal that just went to President Trump, which he just basically threw out and said this is just not something he can work with. For Vahidi and those around him, the ability to forsake something that they've been working on for so long, the aspiration of Iran to have a nuclear weapon, ballistic missiles to deliver those horrific weapons, these are things that they have been aspiring for decades. And so that's a big part of how they see themselves. And achieving this is kind of what their focus is. And to forsake doing so is kind of antithetical in many ways to how they view themselves and how they see the regime and what it's supposed to do. They see themselves as a revolutionary regime, and a revolutionary regime in their minds has to spread revolution. To stop doing these things would be to stop spreading revolution, which gets into the existential reality of, what are they? What are they supposed to do? And these are true believers. It's sometimes said that they are a doomsday suicide cult. I think that's pretty strong language, but in some ways, their ideological bent is probably much stronger than any humanitarian feelings they have for the Iranian people, certainly. So that's a big problem for us to deal with in terms of dealing with this increasingly extreme faction that is taking control of the government over there. So too, they see control of the Strait of Hormuz, which they have exerted. They have been trying to exert that going back 40-some years. I would have anyone go back and look at the reflagging effort that the U.S. had with tankers in the Strait of Hormuz back then, and all the stuff that the Navy and Marine Corps were doing in the Persian Gulf, in and around the Strait, to keep oil flowing from the Persian Gulf while the Iranians were dropping mines and doing all sorts of stuff out there, small boat attacks and things that sound very familiar to what they do today. Just keep that in mind. And they like being able to lock up global supplies of oil, gas, fertilizer, helium. This is their primary means of leverage, and they don't want to give that up. And so, not surprisingly, their proposal had them still kind of controlling the Strait of Hormuz. And they're having a tough time ideologically giving up that one card they have left to play. They're beginning to realize, though, what I should say the Iranian people are beginning to realize is they are kind of stuck in a quagmire. Look, Iran's economy is in a severe crisis. It's facing hyperinflation, its currency is collapsing, industrial contraction. There's widespread poverty throughout the country, and it's exacerbated by the war, the naval blockade tied to the war, and the sanctions regime, which has become even more and more restrictive. The economy is heavily reliant on oil and gas, particularly the exports of oil and gas, which accounts for a major share of the government revenue. But the sanctions and the blockade have basically disrupted all exports, basically curtailed all foreign investment in that country. China's not putting big bucks in that country, obviously, anymore. So that's a real problem. Inflation has surged, 70%? I mean, it's we get excited when it gets above 3% or 4% or 5%. They've got inflation of 72%. Food prices have been rising even faster. I've heard some stuff in some key foodstuffs or food areas that they have had, their purchasing power has dropped to 1/10 of what it was before. So that gives you an idea of how bad things are. The rial, which is the Iranian currency, is depreciated to roughly 1.32 million per US dollar. That sounds a lot like the Weimar Republic in Germany, where they were taking wheelbarrows full of marks, Deutschmarks, in order to buy just a loaf of bread. Well, that's kind of what we're seeing over there. And this is reflecting a long-term currency collapse with just a complete loss of purchasing power throughout the economy. And the question is, how long can they sustain that? The blockade is having an effect. In about 2 weeks, Iran's going to start running out of places to store oil. They've already been pulling old tankers that are not particularly safe out of mothballs and filling them with oil because they have no place, they have no ground storage left. They're just trying to find anywhere. All the rail cars that can hold oil are full of oil. All the pipelines that hold oil are full of oil. Everything is full of oil. They're running out of places to put the oil. The problem they have is that for some fields, in fact, many oil-producing fields, if they shut down pumping in those fields, it's not clear that they're ever going to be able to resume pumping. Some of these wells are really old, and if they stop pumping all those wells for any period of time, I'm not a geologist. My father was, but I'm not. But my understanding is that a lot of those wells will simply, the underground substructure or structure will start to collapse, and they may not have the ability to ever start pumping in those wells again. This would represent a catastrophic situation for Iran, because it's a lot of fields, a lot of wells that they're talking about potentially losing forever. And with that, the regime would never be able to quite recover from what's going on. The people of Iran demonstrated last December or January that they want change, that they want into the regime, and that economics drives their thinking and regime change actions. Of course, the other side is they don't want to go out in the streets and get mowed down by Iranian security forces, IRGC and others, which killed probably somewhere between 40 and 45,000 of them last December and January. So they have to weigh their economic desperation with the more short-term Maslow's hierarchy of needs thing in terms of going out in the streets and actually protesting. But Iran's regime is at an existential crisis. For Vahidi and those around him, acquiescing to U.S. demands on ending their nuclear ambitions, ending their aid to the network of proxy groups like Hezbollah, the Houthis, curtailing production, development of ballistic missiles, and to end what they believe what the regime is all about, would be to include their current grip on the Strait of Hormuz, is just something that they can't really fathom. They can't quite deal with that. As such, the U.S. has options. It can wait out the Iranian regime, although that is letting the economic situation deteriorate further, for not just for Iran, but also it's putting an enormous price tag for the Western world. There are certain things that come out of the Persian Gulf, for example, refined jet fuel, that is causing real problems in Europe as they're running out of refined jet fuel. So waiting them out does have a price tag. And even if they were to suddenly turn things on and the strait was open, it still takes time to load up everything, to get those ships going through. Then you have to look at the situation going through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, and whether the Houthis are going to then try to do something to start actively targeting all the ships going through there. And if that happens again and the ships have to go all the way around the Horn of Africa, then that adds another 2 weeks to the transit time. So you get an idea of there's certain math that goes into all of this, all right? Resuming strikes means accepting that there will be counter-strikes, that there's going to be damage to infrastructure in the Persian Gulf. There'll be attacks going into Israel. Obviously, there'll be attacks on U.S. bases, U.S. personnel, U.S. military facilities in the region. So that definitely dissuades Washington, D.C. from lightly pursuing this path. I mean, I don't think anybody there is hankering to start doing this again. But it is something they have to work through. That is something they have to see. I think what's not really apparent is, and that's just kind of reading the tea leaves, I think there's a lot of stuff happening that we're just not seeing. I think there's things that are probably happening with these separatist groups, like the Kurds, the Azerbaijanis, perhaps the Baluchis, that within Iran, I think there's a lot of things happening there that we're just not quite seeing. I think there's probably a lot of things happening with the anti-regime elements in the major cities as well, the former protesters and probably soon to be again protesters that are out there. And so I think all of this is something that we need to kind of keep in mind with what's going on. So what comes next in the coming days is going to really dictate whether the current regime will survive or whether it will just set a path towards ultimate collapse. Much of that's going to be determined by what they do. It's less about what the U.S. decides, more about what the Iranians choose to do or not to do that's going to drive a lot of this. The U.S., at great cost, has put Iran in a genuine vice. There's no easy route for Iran to go forward. And while not politically appealing, the real politic of an Iran free of the current regime, with hopefully a pro-Western regime that replaces it, has phenomenal value, geopolitical benefit, not just to the U.S., but to all the Middle East and certainly to the world. And I don't think the White House wants to go out there and articulate regime change as our primary goal. They said it once, it didn't fly very well, so they just kind of quit saying that was a goal. But I think the real, behind closed doors, they very much would like to see regime change. And if you look at what we're doing, it's putting in place all the things where regime change could more likely happen than not. Thanks for listening to STRAT. Also, please visit stratpodcast.com. You can go to How Kempfer TV YouTube channel. Also go to my website at www.gripsa.com. And I would also encourage everyone to go to one of the social media sites or to the Los Angeles InfraGard website, and I have a thing I'm doing on maritime choke points and all the implications globally of what these are about. Obviously, the Strait of Hormuz, the Bab el-Mandeb I just mentioned, but a variety of other places around the world and how critical that is for us in terms of supply chain and a variety of other factors that make our world work. So hopefully you'll go there. If you want to go to one place, go to www.infragardlosangeles.org. But you can also find them on Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, X. So they have a social media presence as well. Thanks again for listening, and hope you listen to the next one.